amazing thing because T.S. Eliot has elicited so much of the senses, hasn't he, in our poems. Second, what's wrong with old age? The conscious impotence of rage. Think about The Wasteland and Holloman with this line, at human folly. We think about what Marcus Aurelius taught himself, you're ready to go out into a world where all kinds of people are going to be idiots. I mean, why get mad at them? They're idiots, and you knew they were going to be idiots, but still, he says as you get old, the conscious impotence of rage at human folly, and the laceration of laughter at what ceases to amuse. Again, our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. I've given a lecture on Shelley's To a Skylark. Go ahead and take a look at that one. Right? And last, if you lose the physical sense, you get older. If you lose the emotional sense, you start to get more upset about the stupidity of the world. And last, line 140, this is what else you get when you're old. The rendering pain of reenactment of all that you've done and been. The shame of motives. The regrets, in other words, of all the things you either did or did not do. Of motives late revealed, when you figured it out, but you figured it out too late. And the awareness of things ill done and done to others harm, which once you took for exercise of virtue. I've had seniors that read these lines and say, that's not just what it's like to, be an old person. That's kind of what it's like to be a senior. By the time I get to be a senior, I start to realize all the silly things I did when I was a freshman and a sophomore. I said things to my parents and to other people in my life, and I hurt them. I actually sometimes thought I was doing something good, and I realize now with hindsight, not so good. And it kind of is sad to come to that type of realization, right? Then, line 145, fool's approval stings. This fool's approval, it's amazing, it's genius. By the time T.S. Eliot's writing this, he's already considered the greatest poet of the 20th century, and he knows it. He knows it. He's selling out stadiums when he reads his stuff when he travels to America and to Minnesota. So, he knows it. And yet, he kind of begins to think, you know what, all these people that are clapping me on the back or giving me Nobel Prizes or whatever, they don't really know who I am at all. The fool's approval stings, and honor stains. From wrong to wrong, it's a powerful word that Eliot will use, exasperated spirit proceeds. Unless, soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, of course, you would almost, if you're thinking Mrs. Yates, unless restored by that refining fire. Remember the third section of Sailing to Byzantium? Oh, sages standing in God's holy fires in a gold mosaic of the wall. Come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fasten to a dying animal. It knows not what it is. And gather me into the artifacts of eternity. So this idea then is, Yates, literally we're just referencing Yates here from the third part of Sailing to Byzantium with the refining fire. Where you must move in measure like a dancer. Notice the brilliance of measure, dancer, the way it works together. Of course, the dance is the simile, the metaphor of all metaphors for this, isn't it? And in the end, we're going to get to more dancing before we're done here. And that's the end of it. That's the words. And then, at line 149, the day was breaking. In the disfigured street, because all the bombs had blown up everything, he left me with a kind of valediction. And this is why the use of the word valediction is why some people have said, no, this is John Donne, the great metaphysical poet that T.S. Eliot loved to study and critique. That's what's going on here with valediction, because of his valediction forbidding mourning and all of that. He left me with a kind of valediction and faded on the blowing of the horn, the all-clear horn that, the bell, the bombs have all gone off. Of course, the horn and the bell comes to mind immediately for us, doesn't it, right? Well, I think these lines are significant for us. I think that, as we have said, this conversation that he has been the conversation. We think about the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna, don't we, from the Dry Salvages, the same project, right? As we said here, age is going to give us three gifts, if you want to call them that, right? The diminished senses, the lacerated consciousness, as well as the shameful memories, we might say, right? Ever narrowing creativity is right, as well, at the very end. Think about that. He says it, your creativity will start to go away. He says that, the pilgrim, the compound ghost, right? Well, I liked what Kramer has said about this one, the redeeming reciprocity of these lines. In Burnt Norton, we had in part 2, we had the poet in the Rose Garden. And in East Coker, we had the poet and the sacramental ritual of marriage. And in Dry Salvages, we had the poet and the sacred text with the Bhagavad Gita. And here, for the first time, we have the poet and the dialogicather, that is to say, the conversation. Right? Well, let's jump to 2a quickly. Of course, aging is coming to terms with failure, one of the major themes here mentioned. And to be the symbol, I like the idea of the symbol being the other, right? The voice of wisdom to the poet, right? Moves in measure like a dancer. You are the dance, coming earlier, we heard that, right? At 3a, well, we've already mentioned it. Yeats, Dante's Inferno comes to mind, as well as Yeats' Second Coming, as well as Byzantium. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. At 3b, how do you live with regrets? Right? And what's the best way to do that? I mean, even the things we were talking about as a senior. You know you upset people. You know you did something. I mean, what do? You just go up and apologize? You figure, it's over and it's gone, it's done. I mean, what do? Some people you can't speak to, so for whatever reasons, right? But those regrets. All right, let's turn now to that centering passage, number 3. Here we go, little Gidding, number 3. Jot down, we'll call this the Purify the Motive, all right, section. Lines 152 to 201 or 777 to 826 on the cumulative side. Let's now continue with our reading with the Guinness reading. And again, I challenge you with monkey mind. Just see how well you can do to stay focused as we come now to the end through the middle of this text.
There are 3 conditions which often look alike, yet differ completely, flourish in the same hedgerow. Attachment to self and to things and to persons, detachment from self and from things and from persons, and growing between them indifference, which resembles the others as death resembles life, being between 2 lives, unflowering between the live and the dead nettle. This is the use of memory for liberation, not less of love, but expanding of love beyond desire, and so liberation from the future as well as the past. Thus, love of a country begins as attachment to our own field of action, and comes to find that action of little importance, though never indifferent. History may be servitude, history may be freedom. See, now they vanish, the faces and places with the self which, as it could, loved them, to become renewed, transfigured in another pattern. Sin is behoovely, but all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. If I think again of this place, and of people not wholly commendable, of no immediate kin or kindness, but some of peculiar genius, all touched by a common genius, united in the strife which divided them, if I think of a king at nightfall, of 3 men and more on the scaffold, and a few who died forgotten in other places, here and abroad, and of one who died blind and quiet, why should we celebrate these dead men more than the dying? It is not to ring the bell backward, nor is it an incantation to summon the spectre of a rose. We cannot revive old factions, we cannot restore old policies, or follow an antique drum. These men and those who opposed them, and those whom they opposed, accept the constitution of silence, and are folded in a single party. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated what they had to leave us, a symbol perfected in death. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, by the purification of the motive in the ground of our beseeching.
All right, let's now move to the third movement, the centering movement. Hey, let's play this game really quickly. Notice and compare. Burnt Norton and East Coker both will adapt St. John of the Cross teaching, right? Notice that the dry salvages will include the Bhagavad Gita in those lines between Arjuna and Krishna and all of that, right? Here, we're going to have a combination of the detachment that we learned from the Bhagavad Gita with the mystic Julian, the Dame Julian of Norwich, a mystic contemporary with Chaucer, by the way. Dates are 1343 to 1416. And we're going to play some interesting games here now as we go through these lines. Now, we'll work first lines 152 to 167, and the notion of seeking liberation leads to resurrection. We begin with this observation. There are three, and of course, Eliot loves his threes because of his study of Augustine, right? There are three conditions which often look alike yet differ completely, flourish in the same hedgerow. We're back to hedgerows again, aren't we? Attachment. There are three ways to basically approach your life. One, attachment to self and to things and to persons, the narcissism or the attachment. Detachment from self and from things and from persons. So there's two different ways for sure. To be attached or to be completely detached, right? And he uses the word growing. This is a poem about growing, right? Between them, notice how the word between gets used now at least 3 different times really quickly. Again, between the two wars. I think it's the central idea for Quartets. Between them, indifference. Remember, we quoted those lines from the Bhagavad Gita too. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either is the last line here. And he says, there's a third one here that's indifference. Between them, indifference, which resembles the others, as death resembles life, being between two lives, unflowering. We're back to this notion of growing again. Unflowering, between the live and the dead nettle. More flowers with the reference of nettle, right? Notice the idea here is that we have 2 different kinds or 3 different kinds of options. The worst kind of option is that to be completely indifferent in every way, right? He says, this is the use of memory for liberation, not less of love. First use, by the way, in this poem. It's going to be significant. In fact, it's going to be the central word of the entire poem. Many have argued it's the central word of the entire 4 quartets, although used very, very little, right? Not less of love, but expanding of love beyond desire. And so, liberation, and there's our key word, right? From the future as well as the past. Liberation is, of course, what we all long for. Thus, love of a country, England, begins as attachment to our own field of action and comes to find that action of little importance. We think about maybe T.S. Eliot, who's beginning to ask, okay, I've done some important work, and I am English after all, I am American after all, but I wonder if it's really helped my country or not. He says, but even though that action is of little importance, though never indifferent, so he says, I'm not indifferent to what it is I've done. And then he says something interesting about history. History may be servitude, that is to say, we have to follow it. History may be freedom, that is to say, we can learn from history. And then he uses the word see. I think that's an important word. Look, see, right? It's kind of like the word quick. See now, they vanish. The places, the faces, and places, which the self, with the self, which, as it could, love them. So this is the cyclical understanding again, right? To be renewed, transfigured in another pattern. Of course, when we think of history here, we always think of that withered stumps of timeline from the wasteland. In other words, everything that's gone before us is a way for us to begin to learn how we can renew, be transfigured in another pattern. Of course, patterns are everything for 4 quartets, right? Everything is about the patterns. At lines 168 then and following, we shift. Notice even the length of the lines will tell you about this. Sin is behoovenly, but all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Here, He is quoting directly, although not putting quotation marks around it, he is quoting directly from the Dame Juliet of Norwich, again those dates 1343 to 1416, from her showings or revelations of divine love. By the way, do notice that the word sin here for St. Augustine and for T.S. Eliot is all about forgetting. Sin is a kind of forgetting, right? Now the Christian mystic is going to say, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, the hope for peace, if you will. And then at line 171, we begin with the word if. We pick it up again at line 177, and then at line 182, although the word then is not there, that's how to read this next passage, okay? So read it with me. If I think, again, of this place, England, Little Gidding, the country, the community of Little Gidding, and of people, the English people, not wholly commendable, the word not holy here, meaning that's that fallible. They're okay, but no, they're not saints. Of no immediate kin or kinship, or kindness, I'm sorry, but some of peculiar genius. He could be obviously thinking of himself, maybe Yeats. All touched by a common genius. United, line 176, it's a fascinating line. United in the strife which divided them. Wow, think about what World War II did. It brought all of England together. Wars usually do, don't they? Unless, of course, there's civil wars, which were 300 years past for England and its civil war. As Americans reading this, obviously, we think of our own civil war. And then the second if. If I think of a king at nightfall, Charles I actually did come to this little Gidding church at nightfall, but we can also think about Christ, of course, as the king represented. Of 3 men and more on the scaffold. Lots of speculate about this. Obviously, it's a Christian reference to some degree for Christ and the 2 on the cross with him. And a few who died forgotten in other places, here and abroad. And of one who died blind and quiet. We're back to line 8 in the blindness. Here, probably a reference to Milton. I would argue that if it's not Milton, it's Homer. And I would say both of them, both Homer and Milton, have been in the back of Eliot's mind all his life. I think Milton was the largest millstone around T.S. Eliot's neck, because I think he understood what Milton represented, to attempt things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And I think Eliot recognized that as a worthy goal, and yet a lofty goal, right? Of one who died blind and quiet. Line 182 is finally the then. If, then why should we celebrate these dead men more than the dying? In other words, what's the use? What's the value? We go back to East Coker, line 186. What's the value of all of these great people who have lived? It's not to ring the bell backward. We can't go back in time. Nor is it an incantation to summon the specter of a rose. We can't bring them back from the dead. Notice the word rose is here capitalized. And of course, Christ was brought back from the dead. And then the lines that follow at 187, I mean, there's a lot of political debate around these lines, and I'll let you engage in that, but take a look at it. We cannot revive old factions. We cannot restore old policies or follow an antique drum. In other words, you can't go back, politically speaking. You can't go back to an earlier time. You have to go forward. Note the irony that he says this, because so much of this poem has been about respecting the past, and yet we can't go back to what was once. And this notion of the antique drum obviously tells us, reminds us of Thoreau's line, when he marches to the beat of his own drummer, right? These men, line 190, and those who opposed them, and those whom they opposed, accept the constitution of silence, and are folded in a single party. We think of Plato, always the quest for harmony, in other words. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated. It's an interesting idea. Think about your education as an inheritance. Now, whether you learned it or not, that depends on whether you've taken it or not, right? What they had to leave us. What did all these people of the past leave us? A symbol, line 197, a symbol perfected in death. Well, obviously a Christian reading of this is to reference Christ. And then it comes back one more time to quote again from Julian of Norwich, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. The echoing, right? The repetition, the echoing. By the purification of the motive in the ground soil of our beseeching prayer. Remember from Dry Salvages, the time of death is every moment, right? Now, we've already pointed out that Krishna's teaching of detachment is counterposed in some ways with Julian's teaching of purification. Sin, if understood right, can be transformed into joy and glory, right? Now, this is really some amazing stuff for T.S. Eliot. He has the ability to join the Gita and Julian Norwich of Norwich's showings. I think only a truly genius poet could do something like this and pull it off. At 2a, our message is here, well, with right action or right motive, with right motive, even poor actions can somehow be useful. At 2b, our symbol, it's there at line 196, isn't it? In fact, the word symbol even gets used, right? The symbol perfected in death, obviously Christ here. At 3a, we've mentioned Julian of Norwich and her showings. I recommend that you take a look at that one. At 3b, how about this one? He says it, we cannot revive old factions, we cannot restore old policies, or follow an antique drum, lines 187 to 189. Do you agree? Or do you disagree with that? Well, all right, we turn now to part 4. Hey, we've only got 60 lines left, and so it's time to really sit up and begin to focus seriously on how Eliot's going to finish this thing as we near the end. Let's begin to watch how all of 4 quartets is beginning to be subsumed. Now, to remind, of course, we're working with the lyric, the fourth act lyric. This is the movement, of course, that's going to be so important. By the way, this is lines 202 to 215, or lines 827 to 840. Here, even before we read it, just count number of lines really quickly. Yep, 14. Yep, that's what we call a sonnet. Yes, the genius of Eliot. He's playing all of the poetic games that we could hope to play. This is some brilliant stuff. Notice the rhyme scheme as well that's involved as you go through it, of A, B, A, B, A, C, C, and then D, E, D, E, D, and then either C or F, C or F. All right? All right, let's go ahead. We'll listen to it. Hey.